Welcome, my friends, to Positive Psychology, Coaching and Leadership, or Leadership and Coaching. Forget the order. But in this course, we're going to be looking at this kind of deeper dynamic of kind of applied psychology. It's great. And this is the misunderstanding about positive psychology, that it's like how to be happy all the time. It's actually no. We live in a world that has all kinds of stressors, all kinds of complexities. Not even for this point, but I wanted to just have her here because she's cute. But like holding a baby while doing the intro slide of a university course. Weird times. We're all trying to survive. You're all great people. She's saying yeah, she likes you too. So what's positive psychology in these times? What's positive psychology in an era where you have every legitimate reason in the world to be upset or down or jaded or confused? How do you stay resilient? How do you stay strong? How do you stay focused? How do you cultivate family and community and meaningful real relationships that will sustain you and help you have a life? Welcome to the course. Let's get into it. All right, Charlotte, say good luck. Good luck, everybody. The science of psychology has been far more successful on the negative than on the positive side. It's revealed to us much about man's shortcomings, his illnesses, his sins, but little about his potentialities, his virtues, his achievable aspirations, or his psychological height. His or her, obviously, for all these. And it's as if psychology has voluntarily restricted itself to only half of its rightful jurisdiction, and that the darker, meaner half. And I think with this, Maslow kind of hints at this point that like so much of what's discussed in psychology is when things are going wrong. And that makes sense. It makes sense that an understanding of the mind would kind of have this, or people interested in understanding the mind would have this tendency to want to try to maybe help people that are experiencing mental anguish. And at the same time, though, it's important to understand, and the point of this course is to look at how some of these principles actually have this generative function, or can help people move towards higher levels of personal experience and life engagement and satisfaction and purpose. So in positive psychology, and I know that this slide's like fairly basic, and I'm going to move my picture, but it says in the bottom right there, it says flourishing, right? And it's like there's sort of this traditional psychology has been very focused, and obviously this is an oversimplification, but traditional psychology has been very focused on this idea of when people are mentally unwell, how to get them sort of back to average level functioning, or to become a functioning person again. And sometimes that means in terms of their relationship, sometimes that means in the terms of their own self-talk, or in terms of their behavioral addictions, or in terms of their relational patterns, right? But that for a lot of the history of psychology, traditional psychology is focused on this. I remember when I was in university, it used to be called abnormal psychology, like not normal psychology, like when there was problems with the system. And oftentimes that happened because of some kind of brain injury, or because of some, well, what we would now call the sort of whole array of mental health. And so there's the traditional psychology's viewpoint on this, and then positive psychology is going to be utilizing psychological understandings to go even further and push in more of this generative or growth promoting positive psychology direction, right? And so some of the things we're going to be looking at in this course is like, well, how do we develop relationships where we have like more of those good days, and how do we develop like mental health where we hit those low pits like less, and how do we increase our functioning? And so that's kind of the at the most core level what this is like this trend in psychology to look at how ideas in psychology can be used to improve human functioning beyond just average levels of functioning. So in a course like this, in a special topics course, it's like I'm going to treat it a little different than like a first or second or third year psych class where it's like, we're going through a textbook and I'm giving you a definition. It's like I'm going to kind of assume that you have some understanding, like not some, like a developed understanding of psychology. And in this class, I want to really kind of highlight what's unique about this approach and what this approach can sort of add to our broader conceptualizations of psychology. And like Seligman's saying here, the aim of positive psychology is actually to be a catalyst of change, right? To be a philosophical thread in the literature of psychology that tries to wean it away from just this complete preoccupation focus on repairing the bad things in life to also looking at some of these more positive qualities, right? Like, how do we help people build things like courage and honesty and truthfulness and dependability? And how do we do that in a way that actually matters and actually is like meaningful and relevant and impactful? So an idea from Seligman's work that I want you to know, and you've probably come across this in a different class, but one thing that I might that I want to link to with the first reflection, and I want to make a quick note of that. I'll say this other places too, but I totally understand that I'm like coming in late with some of this stuff, and the first assignment's like on the schedule is due pretty soon. I'm going to definitely give an extension on that and give you more time. So just so you know that, I'll make a more formal announcement too. But I'm going to be asking you to look at this idea, right? Look at this idea of PERMA. And we don't have to take 3,000 notes on it. It's like, actually, I want you to just think about this theoretically in relation to your experience. It's like, okay, there's a lot of ways you could live your life. But what we know is that sort of across the spectrum of ways you can live a good life, if we believe that that's such a thing, it's like there's certain areas where the improvements in those areas have this like kind of butterfly effect improvement over overall experience of life. And those areas are in this area of like developing positive emotions, right? Developing the ability to see the good in things, developing positive emotions as a way to fight against the helplessness and desperation and hopelessness that's so common in our society, or like engagement. Like, how can we a word that used to get used a lot in psychology was called psychological involvement, which is sort of the same idea. It's like, do you care about what you're doing? Are you fascinated with what you're doing? Because that like kind of pulls your work forward. And it's like, and you all know, it's like if you're bored about an assignment or a lecture or a paper or whatever, it's hard to work at it. So it's like, okay, so number one, can we increase the amount of legitimate, authentic, positive emotion in your life? Can we make you feel more engaged and kind of psychologically involved in what you're doing in a way that feels stimulating to you? Can we help build relationships that are characterized by things like trust and loyalty and responsibility and shared commitment? Can we help you establish what your meaning and purpose is in life and add this kind of existential meaning element? Or like, what I mean by that is just this like life purpose, goal, focus, vision, all those kind of ideas. And then the last idea is accomplishment, right? So the A represents this idea that one way to actually start seeing major improvements in our life is to make commitments to these small changes and to chip away at it and to actually start to accomplish things and actually start to see that when we make a plan towards optimizing or towards like sort of getting better or leveling up or making personal improvements in our life, that one way to do that is to kind of make these changes that we can kind of see. And whether we're talking about like physical training or whether we're talking about changing in falling into certain patterns of negative self-talk, or whether we're talking about getting into the same old relationship fights over and over again, that we can actually, through accomplishing successes in becoming this new version of ourselves, that there's actually something psychotherapeutic and generative about that. So that's the PERMA model, which really sort of is just like an acronym to encapsulate basically Seligman's entire theory on positive psychology as a sort of response to learned helplessness, or as a response to the hopelessness and the isolation that people feel. Mature positive psychology needs to return to its existential and humanistic roots to rediscover the richness of lived experience and the many pathways to a meaningful life. This is Dr. Paul Wong, and he makes an awesome argument, and I'll link this article in the course site. I should make a note to do that, but not while I'm recording. But because this is a really, and if I forget to, if someone wants to just shoot me an email saying I forgot to do that, I would love to share this with you, because this is an awesome paper, and Paul Wong does a really good job in this article setting out this idea of like how positive psychology isn't just like flowery talking, like, oh, we should all try to do better and be happy more. It's like, okay, great, but like, how do you do that in a scenario where maybe you're depressed, or maybe you've lost someone, or maybe you're in a negative, isolated situation, and it's like, you need more substance than just trying to be happy. And this is where existentialism comes in, right? Because people have been struggling with these questions of like, who am I, and how do I fit into the world, and what's the purpose of this, and how do I fit into the universe, and is there a God, and is there a soul, and is there a self, and who am I to know any of this, and all these questions about kind of the core of existence, existential. And so over the next few weeks, or through some of today and some of next week, I want to kind of make, or next presentation, make this point about how existential, and then next I'm going to talk also about phenomenology later, but how those two kind of schools of philosophy are almost like the philosophical rationale or the logic behind the aims of positive psychology, because positive psychology is very applied, and that can make it present as if it's simple. And my argument is that it's actually not simple, but what it is it's almost like the surface level outreach of this almost applied existential phenomenological look at human suffering and human experience. And I like this comic because it kind of highlights an interesting joke, right? It's like a guy staring at the stars and being like, why am I here? You know, you can picture that tens of thousands of years ago, and then there's a dude just like on coldslaw.com, just to make sure I double checked, and that's not a website. So I think some guys on like coldslaw.com reading about like salad, just being like, what am I doing? It's like people have been asking themselves questions about like what they're doing with their life. That question is as old as time. On that note of it being as old as time, it's like, I find it really interesting, and a part of this presentation is going to become kind of a breakdown of that article I just mentioned, like Existential Positive Psychology, by Paul Wong, and I think maybe some of his students help, but Paul Wong is like a big name. He's basically the name in Existential Positive Psychology, and this idea of how if you can combine ideas from positive psychologies with this longer mythical, kind of, not mythical, but yeah, sort of like the idea of the hero's journey, the call to adventure, the challenges and temptations, the death and rebirth, the transformation, the atonement, the return. It's like there's a cost we pay as a society for not having this. Society needs heroes, and I don't mean that in a weird way. Like, I mean, because your hero journey might be overcoming a mental health issue, it might be helping a dying older relative, it might be taking care of kids when it's stressful, it might be all kinds of things. And it's like, I think devaluing that heroic aspect of life is a mistake, because I think it actually can be a powerful motive. And again, if you look at the work of someone like Carl Jung, like this hero motif and the hero journey is as old as time. The hero is like literally an archetype. I'll read this to you quick. Existential psychology is about human existence and the human drama of survival and flourishing. It's inherently positive at its core, so it means like it's at its core, it's positive, because it emphasizes the courage and responsibility of confronting this existential anxiety and living an authentic life. Like, how do you live in this world that has all these threats to who we are? And how do you do that in a way that's authentic and real? unfortunately, the popular existential literature tends to focus on the darker side of human condition, right? So like a lot of the, especially if you look at some of the things like Dostoevsky and you look at like War and Peace and, Crime and Punishment, and it's like, it's a really dark look at guilt and shame, and I'll talk a bit more about Dostoevsky specifically next time, but a lot of it's focused on suffering. Existential psychology can learn from positive psychology, scientific methods, and this focus on the positive, and it's not like, so it's a little bit different, right? It's like, what if we use some of those understandings of like meaning and soul and passion and all these things that are often used to talk about despair, but what if we use some of those and explore how they relate to, human optimization, like how if you actually you're in a social environment where you actually care about the people and you exist in an authentic way, in a meaningful way, and you're able to put yourself in positions where, you might be able to have experiences that weren't otherwise available, whether we're talking performative or whether we're talking cognitively or spiritually or whatever. So he's going to be another character we talk about at several points in this course, Dr. Ervin D Yalum, and there's a video I'm going to be including in this presentation that has that references him, and he's somebody we're going to come back to, and he wrote extensively on this idea, like when nature wept, Mama and the meaning of life, love's executioners, the gift of the helper, the Schopenhauer cure, existential psychotherapy, practice of psychotherapy, staring at the sun. I guess I didn't have to read all those to you. Sorry, I'm trying not to just read you this presentation, but there's parts of this that I kind of want you to have in your notes because it'll be helpful, and then there's going to be parts where we're kind of just chatting more. But here I would like you to have this idea that Yalum thoughts, and Yalum's probably the biggest name in group psychology, and I don't mean like kind of social psychology, I mean group therapy psychology, right? Like doing therapy with groups of people rather than individual. And so he talks about these like 11 universals of a therapeutic group, and I'm going to talk about that a lot in the week where we talk about therapeutic groups. But here I want to mention this idea that he has this idea that existential anxieties, so there's like these 4 main anxieties that we deal with. And there's a video coming up that's going to talk about this more, but we're all trying to deal with death. And some of us are running from dealing with that. And he's saying like this is obviously, this kind of bubbles to the surface for people at different times in their life. And sometimes the anxieties are around mortality. Sometimes the anxieties around, he talks about freedom, and this is a kind of difficult one to explain, but basically what he means is like, if you believe in freedom and if you believe in basically free will, then you believe that what you do matters, and therefore you're immediately responsible. So he says people have this like almost desire to believe that the world's just happening to them and that they're not free, they don't have free will, because that excuses things too. And it's a deeper concept, but it's like he's saying this is actually like a core anxiety, like a core existential existence level anxiety, is like this age-old question of free will, right? So freedom and free will are sort of similar, right? Like if you had no freedom, you would have no ability to have free will. I guess you could say freedom is an expression of free will. And then isolation, I probably don't have to spend tons of time in 2022 explaining the existential issues associated with isolation and meaninglessness, or like feeling like what you're doing doesn't matter. In isolation, in that sense, he's talking about a psychological, emotional isolation. And then Paul Wong, in his comments on Yalum, is talking about how Yalum has these 4 main ideas, and then suggests this notion. So if you have in your notes that Paul Wong suggests adding like a 5th and a 6th existential core anxiety around identity, who am I, and happiness, like struggling with this idea that parts of our lives aren't enjoyable, right? And that, like, where does the suffering piece fit in?
Okay, so this is going to be, and part of what I'm doing in this presentation is I'm kind of introducing some of the things we're going to be digging deep into in this course. So I like this quote from Paul Wong that I want to share. And I know today's like very Paul Wong focused, but why I like him is because I know that for positive psychology, you've probably heard of it before, or at least you can pretty quickly get your head around the idea. And I didn't want to spend the whole day just giving you sort of like the history of that, because I wanted to pretty quickly branch into existentialism, because it's what kind of gives weight to this whole line of thought. And over the next, or in the next presentation, I'm going to really dive into some of the existential thinkers behind this. And Paul Wong, I like his essay here because I find that it makes a really nice bridge between the two as he introduces this concept of existential positive psychology. An identity crisis isn't limited to adolescence. It can be an ongoing struggle to define and redefine ourselves when we go through these major life transitions or upheavals. The search for identity requires self-knowledge. The ancient Delphic injunction, that's awesome. So at Delphi, the Oracle at Delphi, carved into the litanel at the temple of Apollo, know thyself. The Delphic injunction, the demand, the teaching, know thyself, right? Famously what the Oracle at Delphi said to Socrates, still resonates with the postmodern generation. Without a clear sense of self-knowledge, we can go through life without ever knowing who we are and what we really want. So this next quote here, and again, you don't have to be necessarily writing these down. You can if you want. These are actually like, what I tried to do is really like, and not just pull quotes from the essay, but sort of, you know, traditional lecture teach and try to just teach what this idea existential positive psychology means. And part of it is going to be breaking down this essay, because like he says here that authenticity, right? Like this is the weird thing. It's like you can, what am I trying to say? It's really hard to be authentic. All you can do is not be not authentic. All you can do is restrict the amount of times you're not being true to yourself. And in doing so, that sort of as a byproduct makes you more authentic. Authenticity, being authentic, the practice of being authentic has been a recurrent theme in existential literature, and one of the real heavyweights that we're going to get into. And I guess you could hear Wong's calling him a kind of referring to him in relation to existentialism, an absolute heavyweight in phenomenology, maybe the phenomenologist after Husserl. Martin Heidegger differentiates or says there's a difference between non-authentic and authentic ways of living. Right? People living in a non-real or non-authentic way give up their individuality and responsibility for the security of being part of the herd. In contrast, authentic, real people, non-phony people assume responsibility to live in a way that's consistent with their own true nature and core values. Right, so you see here, it's like the motivation is coming internally and not externally. They strive to become what they were made to be in spite of the anxiety and risk involved. You know, you could tweak that just a little bit and make that an awesome quote. Strive what you were made to be despite of the anxiety and risk involved. Despite. Let me try that one more time. Strive to become what you were made to be despite the anxiety and risk involved. It's good advice. It's advice from Martin Heidegger. So at one or another point in your academic life, you've maybe come across this idea of flow by Csikszentmihalyi, and he, I got an interesting kind of tie-in with him because one of my professors at Waterloo was named Roger Mano, who worked with Csikszentmihalyi because Csikszentmihalyi was one of his teachers. So there's sort of like an interesting connection with, you can kind of draw a line between him and the psychology department at Waterloo. And he coined this idea of flow, right? That basically there's like an optimization level. There's like a point where a course could be too easy for you and it's boring. And there's a point where a course could be too hard for you and it could be anxiety provoking. And it's about like finding that perfect middle zone is where your performance is going to be highest. And there's a similarity between this idea of flow and Tchaikovsky's idea of the zone of proximal development, but the idea is that there's like a state of pressure, right? So when the challenge is at a level that is high enough, and your skill level, like, so the mixture of what's being demanded and your ability to meet what's demanded. If you're like a professional, if you're like a pretty good hockey player and you're playing against a bunch of kids, it's too easy, it's boring. But if you're playing against pro level players, it's too hard and it's anxiety provoking. But if you're playing with people that are roughly your level and you're in a competitive game that you're really engaged in, it's like that's probably when you're going to have the most like engaged flow style experience. You're in that perfect flow channel. Okay, so flow is going to be an idea that we come to a few times in the course, especially when we're talking about the sport psychology aspect of it. Because as a coach and as a trainer or whatever, or as a leader, you're trying to kind of do what you can to get your team or your individual athlete or whatever into that flow state as commonly as possible, right? As much of the time as possible. As frequently as possible, I should have just said.
Besides neuroanatomical changes in flow, there are neurochemical changes, right? The brain produces a giant cascade of neurochemistry. You get norepinephrine, dopamine, anandamide, serotonin, and endorphins. All 5 of these are performance-enhancing neurochemicals, right? So they make you faster, stronger, quicker, and they do the same thing with your brain. On the front end of a flow state, you take in more information, you process it more deeply, meaning you process it using more parts of your brain, you process it more quickly. There's some debate about this, but it does appear that you process it more quickly. This is norepinephrine and dopamine. So when people enter a flow state, they talk about feeling like their senses are incredibly heightened. This is the performance-enhancing aspect of norepinephrine and dopamine. Where these chemicals really come in handy is how they affect motivation, creativity, and learning. We'll start with motivation. Besides being performance-enhancing chemicals, these are obviously all feel-good drugs, right? These 5 chemicals are the most potent feel-good drugs the brain can produce. As a result, flow is considered the most addictive state on earth. Scientists don't like the word addictive, so instead they use autotelic. When something is autotelic, it is an end in itself. What it means is that once an experience starts producing flow, we will go extraordinarily far out of our way to get more of it, which is why researchers now believe flow is the source code of intrinsic motivation. Another thing that those neurochemicals do is they augment the creative process. So creativity is always recombinatory. It's the product of novel information bumping into old thoughts to create something startlingly new. So if you want to amplify creativity, you want to amplify every aspect of that process. Again, the neurochemicals help. So on the front end of the flow state, when you get norepinephrine and dopamine, they're tightening focus. So you are taking in more information per second. So you're boosting that part of the creative process. Norepinephrine and dopamine do something else in the brain, which is they lower signal-to-noise ratios. So you detect more patterns. They jack up pattern recognition. So our ability to link ideas together is also enhanced. We're taking in more information, we can link it together. Anandamide, which is another chemical that shows up in flow, doesn't just promote pattern recognition, it promotes lateral thinking. So pattern recognition is more or less the linking of familiar ideas together. Lateral thinking is the linking of very disparate ideas together, right? So more information per second, all kinds of pattern recognition, lateral thinking, all of it surrounds the creative process and amplifies all of it, which is why, for example, studies run by my organization, the Flow Genome Project, we've found creativity is increased 500 to 700%. To give you another example, in a recent Australian study, they took 42 people, gave them a very tricky brain teaser to solve, the kind that needs very creative problem solving. Nobody could solve the problem. They induced flow artificially using transcranial magnetic stimulation to basically knock out the prefrontal cortex. They induced artificial transient hypofrontality, technically. As a result, 23 people solved the problem in record time. So massively amplified motivation, massively amplified creativity. The last thing flow does that's really important is it jacks up learning. So a quick shorthand for how learning works is the more neurochemicals that show up during experience, the better chance that experience has of moving from short-term holding into long-term storage, right? Neurochemicals, among their many other functions, one of them is to tag experiences. Big neon signs saying, really important, save for later. because flow is this giant neurochemical dump. It massively amplifies learning. So in studies run by DARPA and researchers at Advanced Brain Monitoring in California, when they introduced flow artificially, this time kind of using neurofeedback, in soldiers, marksmen to be exact, they found that soldiers in flow learned to shoot 230% faster than normal. When they redid this study using novice marksmen, they did it with riflemen and archers, what they discovered is that the period of time it takes to train a novice archer or novice marksman up to the expert level when they're in flow can be cut in half. So Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hours to mastery, what the research shows is that flow cuts it in half.
So before I move on from Paul Wong and get into some of the other ideas I wanted to touch on, but in the remainder of this, I do want to say, like, in case you're in a place of questioning things yourself, it's like one of the ideas from existential thought is that that's actually good. That actually you being dissatisfied with things is actually a sign that you're paying attention and that you're correctly valuing yourself and that you actually have maybe a hopeful view of the world. It's like discontentment. I'll just read this and kind of talk about it. That this idea that discontentment's a double-edged sword. It distracts us from maybe being happy or having life satisfaction, but it also gives us an opportunity of growth and reform. It shows us where there's problems, right? Dissatisfaction with where we are motivates us to advance to where we want to be. Existential positive psychology recognizes that discontentment is an essential part of human nature, right? But distinguishes or says that there's healthier and less healthy forms of discontent, right? So if you're like discontent and mad with everything and you drown it in a bottle and in your own negative self-talk, it's like, okay, that's not pushing anything forward. But if you use it as a way to identify where you can get stronger, that's what the people around you need. Personal greed or blind ambition can represent a destructive type of discontent, but striving for higher values and greater virtues can represent a healthier version. It's okay to be upset when things are going badly, but how do you channel that? It's a cool point, right? Because I really want to, and I don't mean to have like a negative or an aggressive like attitude towards this presentation, but I really kind of wanted to do away with this idea that positive psychology is us all just like pretending that we're happy about things, because it's like it couldn't be less that. It's that actually it's that there's a true happiness that comes from standing tall in the face of adversity. That's a decent quote. I'll go with that. Freestyled. All right, next slide. So I wanted to touch on this, right? That one thing that positive or existential positive psychology teaches is that that mature happiness isn't just this like kind of naive, like everything's daisies and everything's cool. It's like, well, no, it's actually a more authentic happiness that comes from actually being a real person and having real thoughts and thinking your own ideas and not just thinking ideas that you heard someone else say. And it's like there's something about being authentic that is intrinsically rewarding in itself. And then they also talk about how there's this eudaimonic happiness, or basically this like friendship level happiness, right? It's a Greek word, and it basically just means like the happiness that comes from voluntary or kind of like charity or supportive work. And that can be like literally helping a stranger. That can also be like, this morning I was rushed getting ready for my college class, and my daughter was also stressed for school, and there was something I needed to do before I started my class, and my daughter's about to leave, and I decided to like put that thing on the side and spend that time trying to calm her down. And like that's like one little tiny micro thing, but it's like also the most important thing in the world at the same time, right? It's like those small things don't matter and they're all that matters. It's like there's something about doing things for the ones you love that's sort of core to what this whole being a human game is. And then the chironic or chironic, not sure even how to pronounce that necessarily, but it's weird because I've like read that word a million times, but never, I think that's the first time I ever tried to say it out loud, and I kind of bluffed at it. But yeah, it basically just means this like happiness that comes by feeling in a sense of something, in touch with something, right? Like whether you're like, I know a lot of you up in North Bay, some of you are probably campers and hikers and stuff, and get out there in the wilderness, and so I won't have to explain to you the beauty of a still lake or a starry night, and how that can make you feel connected with things. And I threw up as the picture here. That's I'm not trying to be like religious or whatever, but this is Saint Francis of Assisi, who was like famously like known as like the happiest person, right? And he like communicated with animals, and you should look up those stories if you find it interesting. All right, but he would be a good example of someone that found like that kind of spiritual happiness, or is reported to have. Very interesting character. And so Frankl's another one of these guys that I'm going to come back to at multiple points throughout this course. And Frankl, as you probably know about Frankl, and you probably know about how he was in the Holocaust as like or he was in Auschwitz specifically as a prisoner during Nazi occupation of Central Europe. And like one of the things is that when he came out, so let me just say this super quick so I don't just ramble all over the place. So basically he's a prisoner in the camp. One of the things that got him through is this idea that when he got out, he'd be able to reunite with his wife. He gets out of the camp, realizes his wife's dead, had been killed by the Nazis. He goes into this deep depression. What pulls him out of the depression is writing Man's Search for Meaning. And this idea that like actually life can be meaningful, but you have to work at it. You can have creative values that we can give up ourselves to the world through creative efforts, and whether it's through like teaching or through music or through performance or through just being a good person or just playing with kids or like whatever, it's like there's this aspect of using creative efforts to add value. These are ways of adding value and meaning. I mean, think of what value means. Like we use value to talk about like how much something costs. It's like, no, like value is like how much something's worth, and that word's more than just a financial word. What's the experience value or the experiential value? Right, and I just made that like comment about some of you up in the North Bay area. It's like take advantage of starry nights if you can see them. That's literally visual therapy for your brain. It reworks certain wiring patterns. Like basically, the best way I would say it is it's visual therapy. Your ancestors have stared at that kind of light for a long time. For almost all of human history, the only light you would be exposed to at night was stars, the moon reflection, and campfire light. Campfire light's very different than other light. Human beings have been, campfire is another example of an experiential value or spiritual, or like this spiritual connection, right? There's something about looking into a wood burning fire. And I'm not trying to be weird about it, but I'm just saying like your ancestors have been doing that for 100,000 years more. Attitudinal values, we adopt a positive attitude towards negative situations beyond our control. So what he's basically saying is that there's actually a lot of value in the type of attitude you have. There's a lot of value in the type of experiences that you generate for you and for your loved ones. There's a lot of value in the type of creativity you can bring to sometimes trying world. There's a value in all of that, and that value helps us live more meaningful lives full of value, to just say the same word 20 times, right? But that's actually how to incorporate the ideas of Frankl into this broader discussion of positive psychology. So I tried something new in this presentation, and I'm actually hardcore nervous because like in the next slide, and I think 2 points in this, maybe 3, but I think only 2, I watched the video kind of with you and I paused a bunch, and I'm just hoping it turns out really good because that would be a cool dynamic to add to future videos. I've never really done that before. I've done like short reaction videos, but never within a big file, because this is going to be like, I'm getting towards the end, but this is going to be over an hour and a half. So this is going to be a big file. So anyways, I'm just hoping the tech works. If you see me on the next one or coming up and there's a video and it looks like it's like decently synced between me and the video, then I'll be over here pretty happy. So Paul Wong presents this thing he calls the pure model: purpose, understanding, responsibility in both action and in reaction. So think about that. Existential positive psychology's map for you to have a better life is to focus on doing things, or focus on articulating your purpose, understanding the demands of your life and your situation. It wouldn't work as good for the acronym, but you could call that situational awareness, like learning to get better and better at identifying your situation. And part of that is how you're behaving, and this is where R comes in, like this responsibility, or R Street here. R stands for responsible actions and reactions consistent with your purpose and understanding, so that you have this purpose in your life. You're trying to do a certain thing based on your understanding of the world, and so that you're acting and responding to things that arise in a way that's informed by that, that's not just impulsive, and that you're evaluating yourself through self-reflection to kind of check yourself on how authentic you're being. Right, the E represents this constant need for evaluation to ensure authenticity and efficiency, or efficacy. The pure model is efficacy, just that it's actually working, that your plan's working. Right, this is like Piaget's assimilation and accommodation idea, that you're like playing out this model, but this is much more intentional, right? You're intentionally saying, this is what I'm trying to do with my life. This is my situational understanding of what's going on in my world. Based on what I'm trying to do and the world I'm in, my position in it, I need to act and react to situations in a way that reflects what I'm trying to do and how I understand my situation. And I need to keep evaluating that, and that's how I actually become a more authentic, realer person. Whether it's me at a personal level talking about being a better husband, or a better father to my 2 kids, or a better teacher to you, or a better son to my parents, or a better brother to my sister and brother. The pure model has been effectively applied to counseling and coaching situations. That's kind of my other thing, right? So my background is, I did my PhD in applied health sciences, but at University of Waterloo, with a kind of minor my basic focus was on the psychology of martial art participation, and specifically Chinese martial arts, and very much on this idea of how counseling and coaching literature is only sort of like, the overlap is huge. And the potential overlap is even bigger if those fields weren't kind of so set on being distinct. Because really, if you're talking about human performance, it's like a lot of coaching and a lot of therapy has a similar motivational aspect. And it's all about working with different types of people in different types of high pressure, stressful situations. Tons of similarities, tons of similarities. I don't know why I said that twice, but okay, next slide.
Alright, I'm going to try watching this one with you. See how this goes. Remember to pause over here if I need.
Unlimited possibilities are not suited to man. If they existed, his life would only dissolve in the boundless. To become strong, a man's life needs the limitations ordained by duty and voluntarily accepted. The individual attains significance as a free spirit only by surrounding himself with these limitations and by determining for himself what his duty is. In discussions of freedom, there is a tendency to focus on political freedom, but there is another form of freedom.
The I Ching, if you saw that it referenced there where that quote was from, the I Ching, that's like one of the original Chinese philosophy texts,
which today is just as rare. That being the psychological freedom we experience when we recognize our weaknesses and bad habits, and instead of wallowing in self-pity, we exercise our autonomy in pursuit of a better life. This form of freedom is all too absent today. Addictions, compulsions, neuroses, and other self-sabotaging behaviors keep many of us locked in mental prisons and hinder our ability to flourish. Often these issues are attributed to flaws in our genetic or biological makeup. Hence, the solution is to alter our brain chemistry with regular doses of pharmaceutical drugs. but not all agree that a change in our biological makeup is the only, or even the best way, to escape from our faulty ways of being. Stephen Pressfield, in his book Turning Pro, put forth an alternative theory. He argues that many of us will only
So I want you to pay attention to this idea, okay? The reason I selected this video to include is largely around this idea of becoming professional, okay? So I want you to take note, if you're taking notes, around this concept of being a professional that's about to be discussed. I'm going to back it up just a couple seconds.
Theory. He argues that many of us will only find a cure to what ails us if we can regain control of our life and begin moving in a direction which permits us to enjoy the life-affirming experience associated with personal growth. And the best way to do this, he argues, is to commit ourselves to the pursuit of excellence in a self-chosen field, a process he calls turning pro. What ails you and me, wrote Pressfield, has nothing to do with being sick. What ails us is that we are living our life.
Think about that for a sec. Throw that as a quote on your dream board or whatever. It's like, what ails us is that we're living as amateurs. The solution? Turn pro. That's going to mean something different for me. It's going to mean something different to you. Turn pro is somebody that, is professional with how you get your kids ready in the morning. You're professional with your night routine. You're professional with your eating. You're professional with your training. You're professional with how you take notes. You're professional with how you prepare for things. You're professional with how you organize yourself when you go to the store. It's not about being super perfectionist. It's actually the opposite of that. It's not the opposite of that. It's different than that. Being professional, being intentional, being yourself, the same person as yourself, but at a higher functioning level more consistently. Right? Because even if you look at sports, what's the difference between a really good amateur athlete and a pro athlete? A lot of it is consistency, being able to do it on command, time after time, at a super high level. Again, Stephen Pressfield, Turning Pro, and the idea, what ails us is that we're living our lives as amateurs. That's deep. If you take it seriously, that's a deep comment.
Lives as amateurs. The solution is that we turn pro. The decision of the amateur to remain locked in a mediocre life and that of the pro who decides to discipline himself to excellence are both responses to the recognition that life consists of suffering. Yet while the amateur seeks relief from the pain of life primarily through the numbing effects of addictions and the pursuit of pleasures, the pro strives to rise above his suffering through what Pressfield calls.
Right, and those ways of doing things and responding it's not that it's not understandable, it's that it might not be serving you to your, maximum potential, optimum potential. This whole course is about this idea of sort of optimizing potential, right? How can you become a stronger version of yourself, not assuming that there's anything wrong with you, but again, positive psychology. How do we use some of these core psychological concepts and ways of viewing ourselves in our world to actually add value and become better versions of ourselves and become better versions of our relationships and turn pro?
Labor and love. Some people are lucky in that they find a calling early in life and commit to turning pro with little thought as to what they are doing. For others, however, the choice to turn pro requires many wasted years drifting in despair before the realization strikes that a more purpose-driven existence is needed. No one is born a pro, wrote Pressfield. You've got to fall before you hit bottom, and sometimes that fall can be a hell of a ride.
No one's born pro.
If we decide to turn pro, we need to recognize that it is not a part-time endeavor.
It's awesome.
It requires daily sessions of what psychologists call deliberate practice, in which we own our craft through persistence and focus. Our vocation or calling must become a top priority. In place of the hours we previously devoted to pleasurable distractions, we must devote this time to cultivating the habits and skills needed to excel in our work. Turning pro, in whatever field we choose, involves placing ourselves in self-imposed chains of...
And remember, we're not just talking about this as some kind of flowery, fancy philosophy. We're saying that actually, no, it's
a solution for the intense, overwhelming situation that you may be experiencing in your life right now. It's like the way to actually deal with this like massive increase of demand or whatever, like is to become more efficient. And that the trick is inside you. It's like sorry, but with my kid, it's like with my 5-year-old, it's like Kung Fu Panda 1, Kung Fu Panda 2, Kung Fu Panda 3, Kung Fu Panda 1, Kung Fu Panda 2, Kung Fu Panda 3. We're just constantly siphoning through them. So, Kung Fu Panda 1, what's on the dragon scroll? Nothing. The secret to the universe is nothing. You make your own meaning. That wasn't the best description of it. I should do something more specific on the ending of Kung Fu Panda 1. It's actually like one of the deepest movies that exists. But let's keep going with this idea. But the point I was trying to make is like when Po, the Kung Fu Panda, turns pro and becomes the dragon warrior, and becomes the hero. It's like turning pro. That's actually kind of a weird, I kind of stumbled backwards into that one, but I guess it actually is pretty relevant.
Discipline, for paradoxically, this is the path to psychological freedom. Freedom, in its essence, is the acceptance of the chains which suit you and for which you are suited, and of the harness in which you pull towards an end chosen and valued by yourself and not imposed. It is not, and never can be, the absence of restrictions, obligations, or law and of duty. While most people can structure their life around the pursuit of excellence, many flee from this way of life by resorting to two main excuses. The first excuse is based on the belief that we are insignificant creatures in a universe deaf to our desires, and so the point of life should be to enjoy the ride, not to burden ourselves with the task of achieving anything of lasting worth. But this ignores the fact that every one of us possesses an innate urge to growth, and that if we refuse to heed this calling, we become self-destructive and prone to sicknesses of the mind, or as the
Right, so that's like the whole humanistic psychology point, right? And he's about to say, as the psychologist, and I'm not sure, I can't remember, I've only seen this video a couple times, but I liked it. I love the Academy of Ideas, this source. But he was about to quote a psychologist, and I forget, but this is the whole kind of underlying philosophical foundation of the humanistic psychology or the growth psychology movements. That's like all of your like Maslow and Carl Rogers and that whole crew. But this idea of like having this Carl Rogers called it an actualizing tendency, and then like Maslow called it obviously self-actualization, as a lot of you would know.
Psychologist James Hillman wrote, "Present in body and absent in spirit, he lies back on the couch, shamed by his own potentials in his soul that will not be subdued. He feels himself inwardly subversive, imagining in his passivity extremes of aggression and desire that must be suppressed. Solution: more work, more money, more drink, more weight, more things, more infotainment."
Wow. This one cuts. It's like, okay. Let's break this down. Present in body, but absent in spirit. What a way to start that. So it's like you're there, but it's like you've lost your soul or your spirit. He lies back on the couch, shamed by his own potentials in his soul that will not be subdued. So it's like he has this like potential in his soul. So it actually uses the word soul there. That's not being used. He feels himself inwardly subversive. That's an awesome word. So it's like he sees like the world around him is like nonsense, and he doesn't agree with it. And he's like inwardly subversive, meaning like he's inwardly resistant to it. Subversive means like going against the current. But by going against it, by going under it, subversive. Imagining his passivity extremes of imagining in his passivity, so in his state of just lying on the couch, he's imagining this like aggression and desire. Right? Aggression and desire. Can you get more Freudian? Right? So this person is lying back. Just think about this. This is the problem of addiction. This is like the problem of so much mental health. It's like this negative emotionality turned inward. The solution: more work, more money, more drink, more weight, more things, more infotainment. It's quite the quote.
Some of us, on the other hand, recognize the importance of turning pro, yet we continually delay in taking action. We tell ourselves we will turn pro when we find ourselves, or when we have overcome our depression, anxiety, or addictions. Yet if Pressfield's theory has merit, this evasive tactic is again built on a psychological error. For turning pro is not something we do once we have cured our problems or found out who we are. Rather, turning pro is the cure. It is the means by which we become who we are. What we get when we
You want to add that to your note, right? Turning pro is the cure. And I'm not expecting you're taking like word for word note, right? Like notes. Just if there's parts of it that are relevant. The turning pro is part of the cure. It is the cure. It's like, because what you're doing is you're actually, it's almost like you've upgraded your phone's operating system. It's like you've upgraded your brain's operating system, upgraded, and then all of a sudden you're like just processing things differently, and you're a more efficient version of yourself. And some of it is just this like comes from this inspiration that has to come from this hope that what you're doing matters. And this is why at the end of this presentation, as we get deeper into it, and that especially next week, I'm going to be talking so much about existentialism, because at a certain point positive psychology only makes sense theoretically. It's only more than, say, like just a new age whatever flowery snake oil. It's like the only thing that makes it not that is this deep root in existential anxiety and in this existential anguish, like this. And think of existential as just like the word existence, right? Like just all these ideas of like, who are we and what are we supposed to be doing with our lives, and is there God, and what's our role in the universe, and what happens after we die, and what about the people we lose, and all those kind of things. What we find is when we get what we get when we turn pro is we find our power, we find our will and our voice, and we find our self-respect. We become who we always were, but had until then been afraid to embrace and live out.
turn pro is we find our power, we find our will and our voice, and we find our self-respect. We become who we always were, but had, until then, been afraid to embrace and to live out. If we decide to turn pro, it is crucial we do so for the right reasons. For while turning pro will increase our chances of attaining riches, social status, and perhaps even fame, if we turn pro primarily in order to obtain these goods, we may sabotage our efforts. Our energy, if too fixated on worldly success, will cause our work to suffer. If the rewards do not come quick enough, as they seldom do, it is unlikely we will want to continue making the necessary sacrifices required to attain excellence. We will not, in other words, become pro unless we can place our desire for money or status behind our ambition to nourish our skills and potentials. But if we can find the inner drive to commit ourselves to this uncommon way of life,
Right, which is basically like an intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation argument, right? That like if your motivation for all your self-development is reward-based, like it's to get specific things, unless you have this like continually evolving set of rewards that's like always like the new shiny toy or whatever, eventually the motivating power is diminished. And we're going to spend time whole week at the end of the course. And I know I'm like kind of late getting to this course, but please don't think that I'm like taking it lightly. I'm really ready to go deep in this course and to hit some interesting topics. And when I started my teaching career, I was teaching in cognitive psych at Waterloo. That was the first class I ever taught, actually. It was like a social cognition class, and I want to spend some time well, that and developmental psych. Actually, I've been teaching even a little bit longer, but I want to spend some time talking about motivation and drive, but taking it from a very cognitive psychology perspective. And that's like one of the ones, you can see it on the outline. It's kind of near the end of the course. Alright, let's finish up this video. We're almost there.
We will discover that over time, the psychological rewards we obtain far outweigh any form of worldly success. For as we strive towards the heights of personal greatness, our psychological problems will no longer affect us as they once did. They will have been neutralized by a sense of inner peace and accomplishment, sorely lacking in the lives of most.
And notice how he's not saying that, like, your pains will disappear. He actually uses the very specific word neutralized. Right? It's like, think if you have like an acidic chemical in water and you put in a chemical to neutralize it, you're not actually removing it, you're counterbalancing it. It's like you might have stresses in your life or in your relationship. It's like one of the things they say is like being able to like laugh with your partner or like watch an interesting show together that you both like. It's like things like that can really help relationships long term because they can be counterweights to, say, arguments or things that you disagree with. It's like, it's an important concept for like stable long-term relationships. Okay, so let's finish this up.
Or as the Taoist sage Lao Tzu advised,
Lao Tzu.
Chase after money and security, and your heart will never unclench. Care about people's approval, and you will be their prisoner. Do your work, then step back. The only path to serenity.
There's your quote if you're putting something on the wall. Do your work, then step back. Honestly, talk about being a pro. Do your work, then step back. Lao Tzu, the great Taoist. Let me tell this, take 2 seconds, right? So Lao Tzu, this old man, and I won't do the whole origin story, but I could do a whole rant on Lao Tzu. I love Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu is like the person. So anyways, so as he's like, he has these students and everything, he's like this known philosopher and wise man. And as he famously, as he like kind of rides away, because the story is he rides off on a water buffalo into the mountains to like kind of live out his final years as a hermit. And as he's like leaving, one of the students at the gate, the guy at the gate of the town, recognizes him and kind of begs him to write down his teachings before he leaves. So he writes down these like 81 or something, I think it's 81 poems. And that's what's called the Tao Te Ching, and that's the kind of main philosophical text of Taoism, which is one of the main religious and philosophical schools of thought in China, right? So in China, the kind of big ones are Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucian thought, because Confucius was like a absolute heavyweight of a philosopher. Okay, I think this is basically at the end, but I'll just let this play out so it doesn't make the video hiccup. Academy of Ideas. That guy's awesome. I don't know him, but he's cool. Alright, so that video is completed, so I think we're cool. Hopefully that all works good and is synced decently.
So I hope that you liked that last video, the Academy Ideas one about purpose and about specifically, I love that idea about turning pro, and I would want to challenge you, like maybe I should title the first assignment that, but I was going to have it focused on that idea anyways, but what would turning pro mean for you? let me just be personal for a sec. For me, it would mean like sharpening my morning routine a bit better, maybe getting up a little bit earlier so I can make sure that I have a good breakfast myself, because a lot of mornings I end up just making breakfast for Evie and helping her get out the door with my wife. Like if I could really master that morning routine, and then if I could like work on getting to bed earlier, and if I could work on responding to my emails better, it's like those are kind of like there's things in my life that I think I'm doing pretty good, and there's areas I could get better at and tighten. It's like I was just freestyling there a bit about things that were sort of on my mind about tightening up, but like we all have, it's like sit on your bed and close your eyes and be honest with yourself for 5 minutes. Your brain will flood you with areas where you can improve. It's like the idea is the way to level up is to just take yourself seriously and to change those things that you know you can change that are individual to you. You know, as I'm explaining, rambling on this point, I just keep looking at this picture of Martin Buber, another intellectual heavyweight. Right, and he had this idea of I and thou, and that existential difference between me and you. I and thou. Alright, so just for the video's sake, I'll read this out. Existential positive psychology emphasizes the need for building authentic, like real relationships, not fake relationships, and for belonging to actual supportive communities. Right, because it's like, the reason I said actual, I added that. It's not actually, as you can see if you're looking at the video, it's not in that quote, but it's like, I'm trying to get to that point where it's like, oh, we need to build community and have good relationships. Everyone's like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. It's like, who hasn't heard that 900 million times? But it's like, no, specifically, it's not saying good relationships, it's saying authentic, real relationships, true relationships, relationships that are actually based on loyalty and dependability and people that you would go to battle for. And it's like, because that's significantly different than being relationships that aren't defined by that. Buber's model of this I-thou, so Buber's just his last name, model of the I-thou existential encounter represents one of the promising ways to open up authenticity, right? Is like one of my ways to be real is to be real with you. This is, look at this poetic language. To build a bridge across the abyss that separates us. The Chinese value, and this is where existentialism and Chinese, and this is Wang, this is sort of Paul Wong's definition of this, but like the Chinese traditional Taoist philosophy and especially like Lao Tzu and some of the early Taoist philosophers, the relationship between those ideas and existentialism is really strong. And a lot of people like Frankl and Carl Jung were heavily read in Eastern philosophy, what used to be called just generally Eastern philosophy, but more specifically Taoism, which is a weird word because it's Taoism, but it's pronounced as if it's a D. It's pronounced Taoism, but it's Taoism spelled. So anyways, this philosophical value of emphasizing relationships and all kinds of interaction, and actually, like, if you actually, you know, value the people around you, and it's like, then you engage them differently, and they engage you differently. And that little piece of the world is a little bit nicer. I thought this was an interesting quote from Paul Wong too. Existential positive psychology accepts isolation anxiety, right? This anxiety caused from like this sense of not being connected with things, and like, you know, which is as intense now as ever, as an existential given. Like, it's just part of the situation. It's like you're your own person. It's this Martin Buber I thou. There's forever going to be that dash between me and you, or I and thou. It's this, what he called, I forget on the last slide, but something like an abyss, right? Like the emptiness of space separates it. It's always just you. It's always just me. Sorry, I was just trying to be dramatic about that point. The idea here is existential positive psychology accepts that. Accepts, like, of course, because of the fact that you're a unique, individualized biological entity that has a visual processing system, that has two eyes, that, you know, creates your visual experience in a highly personalized way that's then flooded with meaning from your own memory bank to make sense of it all interpretively. It's like that does create a world where you're your own in a very real way, and everyone else is different. But the complexity is that's also true for every single other person. And this is the Martin Buber, the depths of kind of this I thou thing. But recognizes that it's through our loneliness that we seek community and intimacy as a major source of personal meaning. It's like, because we are almost desperate for this connection, it makes the connection more valuable and more meaningful.
A commonly held belief is that psychological disorders are primarily the result of biochemical imbalances which can be treated with pharmaceutical medications. This view, however, is not accepted by all. In the mid-20th century, there arose a therapeutic movement called Existential Psychotherapy, constructed upon the idea that some psychological disorders, such as cases of anxiety and depression, are the result of an individual's inability to reconcile themselves with certain characteristics of the human.
So, one thing that's important to keep in mind with the history of psychology is oftentimes things exist in response to other things, right? So there's like, all of a sudden things start to go in a huge behavioral trend, and then in a huge cognitive trend, and then in a huge biological trend, and then in a huge pharmaceutical trend, and then in a huge anti-pharmaceutical trend, and these are like back and forth. And anti-pharmaceutical, like if you look at the work of somebody like R.D. Lang, like if you put in R period D period Lang, like L-A-G L-A-N-G, fascinating guy. He was a Scottish psychologist. Read that. Existential psychotherapy is based on the idea that some psychological disorders are the result of an individual's inability to reconcile themselves with the certain characteristics of the human condition, like death or morality, or the fact that, you know, we all have an expiration date, or that we lose loved ones, or that we can be betrayed.
Human condition. While biochemical imbalances may be present in such people, the imbalances are not necessarily the cause of their suffering, but rather a symptom, the cause being their inability to deal with the existential dilemmas of human life. Treatment for psychological afflictions of this sort, according to existential psychotherapy, involves...
So again, I think, like, you're all smart people, you have to take all these perspectives as a part of the puzzle, right? Obviously there's scenarios where pharmaceuticals make sense for some people in certain situations. Now, what the existentialists were saying, though, at the time when a lot of them were doing their actual base writing, is that the field at that time was viewing pharmaceutical-based solutions as the answer to everything, right? So a guy like R.D. Lang is actually really critical, not necessarily of medicine, but of the rise of this field of psychiatry, right? Like, not psychology, psychiatry.
Not medication, but self-reflection, philosophical exploration, an expansion of awareness and acceptance of the human condition. In this video, we'll provide a brief overview of existential psychotherapy. In the process, we'll examine some of the characteristics of human existence which can stimulate suffering, and explore ideas on how to deal with these issues and live a more vibrant life. Existential psychotherapy has its roots in three schools of thought: phenomenology, humanistic psychology, and existentialism. From phenomenology,
Okay. I probably shouldn't jump around with the video too much when I'm recording like this, but it looks like it's doing it pretty crisp and clean. This is pretty cool if it works. So phenomenology is something that I'll teach about, and I'll do next time, the second lecture, when I'm talking more about existentialism specifically. I'll get into phenomenology quite a bit. And phenomenology is, well, it was like a main part of my focus of my PhD research, and it's really looking at this idea of as human beings, we're not just like walking around with eyes that are video recorders, just objectively viewing everything. We're adding meaning into everything we're seeing, and our perception is right up at sensation. And so we're having phenomenological experiences because of that. And again, I don't expect you to have that in your notes, and that just what I just rambled there makes sense, because it's what it really is this whole, it's a branch of philosophy that kind of comes from Germany, sort of pre-World War II. A lot of the work of people like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger is definitely the most famous name. The humanistic psychologists, you'll know, like this is going to be like Maslow and Rogers and guys like that. Existentialism, you'll have heard of Frankl.
From phenomenology, it borrows the idea that the individual's immediate experience and personal grasp of reality is primary and the appropriate subject of concern. Ludwig Binswanger, one of the best-known existential analysts, conveyed this point. There is not one space and time only, but as many spaces and times as there are subjects. From humanistic psychology, existential psychotherapy borrows the idea that the individual, far from being a plaything of deterministic forces, has the capacity to change and direct their life and fulfill the innate human desire to live fully and realize one's highest potentials. And finally, existential psychotherapy borrows many insights concerning the human condition arrived at by existential thinkers of the past. These thinkers were largely concerned with what can be called the ultimate concerns of human existence.
It's really interesting, because I'm not actually sure who that third guy was, but that picture there, they had three people, and one was Nietzsche, and the other one was Dostoevsky, and it's interesting that they're both there, right? Because like Nietzsche's one of my favorites, but he's like a real heavyweight philosopher, and then Dostoevsky is more of like a literature writer, right? Like he wrote Crime and Punishment, the epic classic. And in some ways they're very similar, right? But they're kind of interesting because they're like fiction and nonfiction, but both sort of presenting a similar philosophy, this existential philosophy.
This video will explore 4 of these ultimate concerns: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, as well as insights which can limit the suffering such concerns can cause. Death is perhaps the most obvious of the ultimate concerns. While life is the possibility of possibility, death is the impossibility of further possibility, the ultimate boundary that limits and structures our existence. Some have proposed that the fear of death greatly influences our existence.
Look at that. Life is the possibility of possibilities, Soren Kierkegaard. Yeah, the possibility of possibility. The impossibility of further possibility. It's really interesting when you start looking at like how much of philosophy goes back to people like Kierkegaard and even Immanuel Kant before him, Hegel, Heidegger. There was this real like strong European philosophical movement. As a leak to one of your assignments, I'm gonna get you to look into one of these people, and these two are both on the list, Heidegger and Kierkegaard. They're both just absolute philosophical heavyweights.
Some have proposed that the fear of death greatly influences our internal experience. Lurking beneath our every waking moment is a death anxiety which subconsciously influences our behavior and structures our worldview. The 20th century psychoanalyst Gregory Zilberg wrote that, if this fear were constantly conscious, we should be unable to function normally. It must be properly repressed to keep us living with any modicum of comfort. The 17th century French author François de la Rochefoucauld put the same point more succinctly. You cannot stare straight into the face of the sun or death. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist and author, proposed that human beings repress the fear of death through the attempt to achieve what he called symbolic immortality. According to him, there are three main ways this is done: the biological mode of living through one's progeny, the theological mode of believing in an afterlife or reincarnation, and the creative mode of attempting to live on through one's works. Some have noted, however, that there is a danger in repressing one's fear of death too much, arguing that we need a little bit of death anxiety to seep into our conscious experience to help us live more fully. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne urged that we need to practice familiarizing ourselves with death, keeping death in our rearview mirror, so to speak. He who would teach men to die, wrote Montaigne, would teach them to live.
Which is interesting, right? Because that sounds like morbid until you think about it like... the samurai were famous for that too. The samurai would spend a lot of time contemplating their own death. And that sounds like you're like, what? Like, oh, why is that something you should... Well, because then when they were in battle, they weren't afraid. They had already processed the cognitions associated with those experiences. And so they could respond more in the moment. He who would teach men to die would teach them to live. And then, right, because part of it is that it also, when you contemplate things like that, it forces you to examine like what you actually care about and how much weight are you putting into things that don't really matter, or maybe even people that don't really matter, or that are, not going to be there in the long term. It's like, it forces you to really take this existential look at who you're trying to be in the life you're trying to live, and at the very core of it, that's all existential is, right? Like existentialism, you could find 900 books probably at the local Nipissing library. Not 900, but a bunch of books on existential stuff, and lots of people will say it lots of ways, but it's basically the root word. And I've always been fascinated with like the breaking down the actual word like exist. There's this existence aspect, right, of like, well, the fact that we even exist, and that there's something and not nothing, and that we live in the universe, and that we don't understand the universe, but we live on the earth, and we don't really understand our history on the earth, or what we're doing, or what we're gonna be doing, or how we're supposed to be, or what does supposed to be even mean, and all these questions, right? All these like existential questions.
In his book, Existential Psychotherapy, Ervin D Yalum nicely summarized the benefits of becoming more closely acquainted with one's fear of death.
So we're going to be looking at a lot in this course. If you look ahead, there's a lecture called, I forget what I titled it, but it's about like humanistic aspects, or like therapeutic groups, I think I called it. We're going to be looking at Yalum's work. He just called him Yalum. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Yalum, but it doesn't really matter. Really big name in terms of group psychology, probably the biggest name in group psychology. Like how to actually run like a, and when I mean group psychology, I don't mean social psychology, I mean like doing like group therapy with groups of people.
Denial of death at any level is a denial of one's basic nature, and begets an increasingly pervasive restriction of awareness and experience. The integration of the idea of death saves us. Rather than sentence us to existences of terror or bleak pessimism, it acts as a catalyst to plunge us into more authentic life modes, and it enhances our pleasure in the living of life. While death is the most obvious of the ultimate concerns, freedom is perhaps the least obvious. It is usually assumed that freedom is intrinsically desirable, but quite frequently individuals are apprehensive about freedom, and in the words of Erich Fromm, can even develop a fear of freedom. Can freedom become a burden too heavy for man to bear, something he tries to escape from?
Erich Fromm would say that, but no, it's see, these people, I say that kind of tongue in cheek. Erich Fromm So I don't know how much, if you're interested or not, but I'm going to assume you are kind of interested in the history of all this. And so what I'll do when I'm talking about some of these guys and some of these psychologists, some of these ladies too, that are some of these women too, like especially when we're talking about people like Karen Horney or Anna Freud or some of these big names that we're going to talk about that have relevance to these discussions, is like they were interesting people outside of just their immediate field. Like Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst, right? So he's trained Freudian, but then he was really politically socialist and got really heavily involved in this group called the Frankfurt School, which you might have heard of or might not have heard of. And if you have, it's interesting to look into who they are. And it shouldn't be surprising that these people like all had, whether we're talking about Skinner, this is more like the other course I'm teaching in developmental psych, but when you talk about someone like Skinner and the fact that like Skinner had ties with the US Defense Department, and of course he did, because these people were huge names in highly relevant fields that were emerging, and there were also a lot of political and cultural and social things and military things and economic things happening at that same time too. So none of these things happened in a vacuum, and so there's like this deep history to all this stuff. Sorry, I got a bit rambly there just from the name Erich Fromm, but an interesting psychoanalyst who kind of took Freud's ideas and brought them to this other way, right? So like the Frankfurt School is sort of a combination of, or a forced merger of Freudian psychoanalysis and well, basically social Marxism. The history is fascinating. It's all this stuff, like the last 150 years or so, right? Because it's all like, look at this picture too. It's like people walking in a circle with guards like watching them march in a circle.
To be free means to be responsible for one's life, the author of one's own destiny. Because of the overwhelming series.
At that point, I do agree, right? Because I was struggling to see the point there of like, because I've seen this video before, but not for a while, and I was like, I'm trying to watch it, not like pretend like I haven't seen it, but watch it somewhat like I'm watching it with you. And I was struggling there with like that idea of sometimes freedom's too much of a burden. It's like, anyways, I was struggling with that point, but this idea of like, yeah, it's like for some people, I think that, well, there's an ownership and responsibility and obligation associated with the idea that there's like more of an internal locus of control, or like the idea that like what you do matters and you have responsibility. You're responsible for what you do. And then therefore, if you don't work hard, then you're responsible for that too. Right? So sometimes thinking that it's not your responsibility, there's not the benefit and the reward attached, but there's also not the risk of failure.
Seriousness and importance of this task, people frequently flee from freedom and hence the responsibility of determining one's own path in life. It is certainly true, wrote Abraham Maslow, that many of us evade our constitutionally suggested vocations, call, destiny, task in life, mission. So often we run away from the responsibility.
Constitutionally suggested vocations. That's awesome language. Right? Like your actual constitution, what actually makes you up. Your call in life, your destiny, your task, your mission. So often we run away from responsibilities dictated by nature, by fate. Dictated, or rather suggested. I'm interested to know if those, what's in the brackets has been added or was in the original quote. But either way, that's an awesome quote by Maslow. And see, okay, I kind of lost my point earlier of what I was trying to say there, but I think one thing, especially since all of you are probably coming from different places in your learning process, I think one thing that I can kind of add to the story is a little bit of that. Like, I've always been fascinated with who these people were as real life people and how they kind of fit together and the interrelation between them and stuff. Maslow's one of the best ones in terms of, like, I don't know. I still haven't heard of like a shady side of Maslow, so. And if you know something, please don't wreck Maslow for me. No, I'm just joking, but like, well, and it's not that they have shady sides, it's just that it's just that psychology obviously has a darker, less spoken aspect of its history, and a lot of it is in the experimental psychology areas. Okay, let's get back to this video.
Abilities dictated, or rather suggested by nature, by fate. Many existential thinkers have suggested that when one ignores their constitutionally suggested vocation and thus lives inauthentically, it is possible to find one's way back to an authentic existence through feelings of guilt. Ervin D Yalum wrote, "One who fails to live as fully as one can experiences a deep, powerful feeling which I refer to here as existential guilt. Existential guilt is a positive constructive force, a guide calling oneself back to oneself."
Existential guilt. It's like guilt at an existent level, like you're like guilty to your own spirit or to the universe, and again, it's like the religious language. Well, again, it's like at this deep level of depth, the religious language sort of makes sense to people. And that guilt that you're not being the person that you could be, that's a tongue twister. The guilt that you're not being the person that you could be being is, Yalum's talking about this as a constructive force, a guide calling oneself back to oneself. The guy's a poet. Yalum actually is a really good writer, and in terms of like, if you were to just pick up psychology books and read them, the existentialists are the best reads, right? Because they're, well, to a degree, I don't know how much I mean that. I do mean that to a certain extent because they're philosophical, right? Like existentialism is and this we're going to get into more next week, but the roots of it are philosophy. So a lot of the people that are kind of existential philosophers kind of have one foot in both doors. So the writing tends to be a little more philosopher-ish. Alright, back to the video. You guys are like, okay, we get you. Back to Anyways, this is kind of, I hope, what this class will be like, right? I'll do some stuff where it's like more traditional PowerPoint, and then I want to kind of add in some of these, especially if I review this and it's not glitchy and it looks good. This is a kind of cool way to review a video.
The extent that one accepts their freedom, and thus the fact that one is responsible for one's destiny, one is faced with the chilling realization that one is alone. Existential isolation, referring to an unbridgeable gulf between oneself and any other being, is another ultimate concern that each individual must come to terms with through the course of their psychological development. The 20th century psychotherapist Helmuth Kaiser wrote, "Becoming an individual entails a complete, a fundamental, an eternal, and insurmountable isolation." The fact that becoming an individual entails isolation explains why many people cower from the task of becoming an individual, preferring instead to alleviate their feelings of loneliness via conformity and immersion in the masses. Erich Fromm, in his book Escape from Freedom, noted the intimate connection between existential isolation and conformity. He adopts entirely the kind of personality offered to him by cultural patterns, and he therefore becomes exactly as all others are, and as they expect him to be. The discrepancy between I and the world disappears, and with it, the conscious fear of aloneness and powerlessness. The person who gives up his individual self and becomes an automaton, identical with millions of other automatons around him, need not feel alone and anxious anymore. But the price he pays, however, is high. It is the loss of his self. The path to becoming an individual...
That is an awesome word. Automaton. let's go over this for a sec. So he's talking about people that don't want to kind of think for themselves, so they just go along with whatever they're told to, probably back in the day by the religion, nowadays by their phones. He adopts entirely the kind of personality offered to him by the cultural patterns. That's so like condescending in a way too, and therefore becomes exactly as all others are and as they expect him to be. The discrepancy between I and the world disappears, and with it the conscious fear of aloneness and powerlessness. You're not afraid, you're the group. The person who gives up their individual selves becomes an odd automaton. You know, as Pink Floyd would say, a brick in the wall. Identical with millions of other automatons around him. Need not feel alone or anxious anymore, but the price he pays, however, is high. It's the loss of the self. Nice, Eric Fromm. That's a solid quote.
Requires that one not flee isolation, but embrace it, suffer it, and develop the ability to actively face the feeling of being alone and abandoned by the world. The feeling of being alone and abandoned by the world can force one to question the meaning of life, another ultimate concern each individual must wrestle with. It is very common for people to struggle with the question of life's meaning, which Albert Camus called the most urgent question of all. But confronting this question is of the ultimate importance, for as Carl Jung commented, meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. Many existentialists have stressed that the ultimate meaning of human existence is unattainable. As Viktor Frankl put it, the ultimate meaning necessarily exceeds and surpasses the finite intellectual capacities of man. But while the ultimate meaning of life may be out of our grasp, this does not preclude one from finding personal meaning, or meaning to one's own existence. Modern humans face the task of finding some direction to life without an external beacon. How does one proceed to construct one's own meaning, a meaning sturdy enough to support one's life? Although constructing one's
Right, how do you live your life without like a specific user's guide and roadmap? There's no external beacon. There's no like lighthouse in the distance.
own meaning is an individual task requiring an individual solution. Numerous thinkers have isolated self-actualization as a particularly potent solution. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle asserted that the proper end or aim of each thing is the realization of its own being, or the actualization of its latent potentialities. An acorn's proper end is to develop into a healthy oak tree,
That's awesome.
while the individual's proper end is to actualize the latent capacities within,
Your proper end
an
is
idea
to
expressed
reach
in
your
the
full
ancient
potential.
Greek poet Pindar's assertion to become who you are. Becoming who you are is not a guarantee, but a difficult and arduous task requiring self-knowledge, commitment, and courage, and is thus a purpose or meaning worthy and sturdy enough to support one's life. It is reasonable to assume in practically every human being there is an active will toward health, an impulse toward growth, or toward the actualization of human potentialities. But at once we are confronted with the saddening realization that so few people make it. Only a small proportion of the human population gets to the point of identity, or of selfhood, full humanness, self-actualization. While the ultimate concerns which structure and limit our existence, death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness,
Right? Because somebody that's self-actualized is like the opposite of an automaton. An automaton like is so the group that they're not their own identity. They're the group. It's a devastating distinction if you kind of get what I'm saying here.
can be burdensome, fear-provoking, and even tragic, it is possible to come to terms with them by reflecting on the human condition and actively working towards an acceptance of the fate which binds us all. Although these ultimate concerns are problems which have no single solution and cannot be solved once and for all, it is important to remind oneself of Seneca's insight into the power of the human mind. There is nothing too difficult and arduous for the mind of man to be able to master, and that does not become familiar by constant meditation. Each of us has the ability to integrate the ultimate concerns of human existence into our being, meditate upon them, and eventually rise above them. For as Nietzsche said, there are heights of the soul from which even tragedy ceases to look tragic. Or in the words of Carl Jung, the greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. What on a lower level had led to the wildest conflicts and to emotions full of panic, viewed from the higher level of the personality, now seemed like a storm in a valley seen from a high mountaintop. This does not mean that the thunderstorm is robbed of its reality. It means that, instead of being in it, one is now above it.
Carl Jung, to just accentuate this whole video, this does not mean that the thunderstorm is robbed of its reality. It means that instead of being in it, one is now above it. Awesome quote. Alright, I hope you enjoyed that video. Catch you on the next slide, my friends. Alright, my dear students, I hope you enjoyed that class, okay? I really appreciate you spending the time here, and let me leave you with this quote. Existential positive psychology is intended for all people, especially the suffering masses, with its emphasis on integrating negative experiences with positive ones. You know, it's not about erasing bad things, it's about, well, I guess it's about, and to a certain extent, it's about, you know, reducing the negativity in your life, but it's also about, like, maybe you've had experiences or something that can't be undone, but that counterbalancing positive experiences can be added to help establish a path forward. Existential positive psychology highlights the painful human strivings which Western society, consumer culture wants us to ignore. Existential positive psychology stresses that it's only through our struggle and through our fortitude, our strength in that face of that struggle, that we will grow psychologically and spiritually. It's only through embracing life in its totality, including the bad parts, that we wrestle with the ultimate concerns that can uplift humanity and improve the human condition. Love yous. See you next week.